Good morning. I'm Jeff Alexander, Chief Executive of Gatwick Diamond Business, and I'm very pleased that you could all join us this morning for our Ask the Expert session. This morning, it's obviously a very, very topical issue in that we're joined by Jonathan Deegan from GAL. And Jonathan is he's the lead for the Northern Runway DCO. DCO, you'll get a lot more about that, but that's in layman's terms is the sort of planning that has to be gone through. I hope I'm right there, Jonathan. So Jonathan is going to bring us up to speed, if that's the right term, on the Northern Runway, and you know, it's good to see from my perspective at least, and I think from GDB's perspective generally. Not all businesses necessarily agree that, you know, the process is continuing, but there's a long way to go. So without further ado, I am going to introduce Jonathan and hand over to him, and then of course there'll be the usual time for questions, answers, comments and discussion at the end. So Jonathan, where are you? You're right next to me, Jonathan, on my screen, so over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I'll begin to share my screen. And thanks for the introduction. I am the expert, if you like, on Northern Runway programme. What I'm not the expert on is the whole of Gatwick Airport. So your questions at the end, I'll be able to deal with many of them, but perhaps not all of them. But anyway, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Okay, let me share my screen. Let me try and share my screen. Can everybody see that?
There you go. Yeah, it's there.
Grand. Okay. So a little bit first about, come on, where we are now. 2 years ago, 2018-19, this is where we were. We were doing just over 46 million passengers. That's a 2018 number, 46.6, 46.8 in 2019. Supporting 85,000 UK jobs across all the supply chains and contributing about 5.3 billion to UK GDP annually. That's before pandemic, of course, and 230 global destinations. It's no surprise, I'm sure, that the operation at Gatwick has been significantly hit by the pandemic. I know many businesses have. But the airport business in particular, and the people who depend on us for their livelihoods too, have been particularly badly affected. And this kind of graph kind of tells its own story. The black line is the passenger throughput at Gatwick in 2019, and below that is what's happened since March 20 to date. So we were down about 80% in March 22, February 21. Remains to be seen how things will recover this year. We're hoping that the changes in travel restrictions will mean gradually that we see a rise in passenger numbers. Whether we see that lump in August, September that we saw last year remains to be seen. I think depends largely on the traffic light system, whatever one thinks of it. But obviously, such a significant drop in passenger traffic has also meant a very large drop in income, because most of our income comes via landing charges. The traffic light system itself, where are we at the moment? Well, as you know, reading the news, it seems to change quite frequently. We've just had a few more go from green to amber. May half term wasn't too bad, about 1,000 movements. Largely to Portugal, Madeira, Gibraltar. But we are still operating out of just one terminal. We've had to take some fairly drastic action to keep the business afloat, including additional borrowing, both from our own lenders and from the Bank of England scheme. But cost cutting is obviously a major part of keeping ourselves viable. So we've had to close South Terminal. It's still closed. Not sure when that's going to reopen. It'll be down to when passenger demand begins to return in earnest. And we've also, unfortunately, had to see a significant number of redundancies, both compulsory and non-compulsory, over 2020 in order to keep the cost base where we need it. But we have enough people to operate the airport, in fact more than enough people to operate the airport. We're just waiting for the point at which travel returns, and we need to be ready for when passengers are ready to come back. Future outlook is, I would say, rosy, depending on when things get back, but EasyJet are intending to ramp up their capacity at Gatwick. BA planning to come back in 2021, exactly when remains to be seen. And others like Wizz Air are planning to expand too. JetBlue have now got a flight to the US, and we're talking to others too about opportunities. So it's still an airport that's strongly in demand with carriers. Second to Heathrow, of course, in terms of where people would prefer to fly from, both passengers sometimes and the airlines, but still number two in terms of the demand and the way that the demand distributes itself around the London system. All of that, of course, means that we do have a significant impact on the regional economy and the local economy, of course. And we recently commissioned a new report to look at how we expect the airport to recover and what we can expect when it does. And we think that's another 50,000 jobs by 2028, over and above what we were doing during the pandemic. That's obviously we had a reduction during that, and up to 8.4 billion compared to where we were in 2020, although 2020 was an unusual year. But we do expect by 2028 to be up at about 8.4, which is higher than we were before, because we will have seen a growth in traffic at Gatwick, we think, beyond 2019 levels by the time we get to 2028. Opinions divided, but generally the market thinks that we're going to get back to 2019 levels of aviation demand by late 2024, early 2025. And then beyond that, we expect to see additional aviation demand growth, as the government does too. And when you look at their recently published documents, particularly around the Jet Zero consultation, which came out yesterday, which is obviously a very relevant and pertinent document for us. Our capital investment programme, not unnaturally, has also had to be completely revised. Normally, we're doing about 250 million a year, and we have been since the airport's acquisition in 2009. We've had to cut that drastically. One of the programmes that's still going ahead unchanged is, of course, our commitment to the railway station upgrade at Gatwick. It's a significant project and a large part of our capital investment that we're still making in 21 and expect to make in 22 is going into that. Another large chunk of it is going into what we're about to talk about next, which is the Northern Runway programme, and pursuing that development consent order process, which is labour intensive and costly, as I'm sure many other DCO applicants can tell you, but certainly from our point of view, we think it's worth it. And it may seem odd that at a time where traffic numbers are so depressed, we're pursuing airport expansion plans. That might seem completely counterintuitive, but the planning process itself is a long one, and albeit the 2008 Planning Act has made it a little more streamlined in terms of the statutory part of the process, but there's a lot to do before you can launch a DCO application. And then beyond that, of course, even if you get consent, there's still the construction of the programme. So the Northern Runway programme, which we'll go on to now, wouldn't be in operation until about 2029, even on the pursuing the DCO as we are now. So we are really looking at growth when the pandemic hopefully will be long behind us and aviation demand will be back to normal levels. So a quick overview of the project. It really began with Gatwick's master plan back in 2018. we issued a draft master plan and we consulted on it from, I think, October 18 to January 2019. It contained 3 scenarios for growth. One, more intensive use of the existing runway. Number 2 was the dual runway operation that we're going to talk about now. And number 3 was continuing to safeguard for an additional runway to the south of the airport. Now that's the scheme that the Airport Commission said, no, we don't think that's the right answer for the next piece of airport, or the next runway in the southeast of England. That was their decision in 2015, supported by the government since. But nonetheless, the government does still continue to safeguard the land for that runway if it were ever to be required. But that isn't what we're here to talk about today. What we're going to talk about is option 2 for expanding the airport, or capacity at the airport, which was bringing the Northern Runway into operation alongside the main runway in a dual runway operation. That had 66% of respondents supporting it in the consultation, giving us confidence that this is the right thing to do. So what is it all about? Well, on that diagram there, which is taken looking westwards, you can see the main runway in blue, and the Northern Runway already exists. It's there, it's that red strip, often called the standby runway. We use it quite a lot, about 3,000 movements a year on average, and we use it when we're usually when we're resurfacing the main runway or repairing something on it, doing routine maintenance. Everything takes off and lands on the Northern Runway, albeit that's usually at night, so that we're reducing the number of movements that the Northern Runway's got to handle. The idea is that we would bring that into operation alongside the main runway. So it will be a completely privately financed initiative, and as you'll see later, it's pretty low impact because most of the development is within the existing airport boundary. It's not like the additional runway to the south, which would have quite a significant impact on land. It's all more or less within the airport boundary. We'll touch a bit more on that later. The way it works is relatively simple. Our main runway at the moment is what we call a mixed mode runway. All that means is that you have aircraft landing and aircraft departing on the same runway. It's not a segregation runway because there's only one of them. Some other airports have more than one runway, can have segregated operations where you take off on one only and land on the other. We have a mixed mode runway. As an aircraft lands and its wheels hit the ground, it's no longer flying, but it then takes 40 seconds or so to clear the runway as it slows down and then turns off. That means there's an opportunity to launch an aircraft down the Northern Runway alongside it once it's no longer in the air, and get a departure off that Northern Runway in the time it takes the aircraft to slow down and then leave the runway. So it will only ever be used for departing traffic and the smaller aircraft as well, as the code sees, which means a 737 A321 type or size of aircraft rather than the larger twin-engined or even quad-engined aircraft. But it kind of interleaves movements, departure movements on the Northern with the main operation on the runway, the main runway. So we get more capacity without a great deal more infrastructure. And as I say, we believe we could, planning permission being granted, of course, which is never a foregone conclusion, this scheme could be up and running by the late 2020s, let's call it 2029. What does that mean for expansion at Gatwick, the numbers? So the orange line is where, in the middle of that line, whether traffic will recover to about 30 million in 2021 is beginning to look doubtful. But as I said before, what the market more or less agrees on is that by the end of 2024, beginning of 2025, we should be back at 2019 levels. So that's that kind of marker I've put on the graph there. Beyond that, we expect growth at Gatwick to continue in much the way it has done before, even with a single runway operation, through more efficient use of the runway, through upgauging of aircraft, in other words, and airlines changing aircraft for slightly larger aircraft when they reach the end of their useful life, and through improvement in load factor, in other words, a greater percentage of seats on every aircraft being filled. So efficiency in the kind of booking system and management system. If we don't get dual runway operation consent, then growth would continue up the blue line, and we think it could get to about 62 million passengers annually by 2038. With a dual runway operation, it will go up the amber line, and we think it could get to 75 million passengers. So about a 13 million passenger difference, which is quite significant and means, because of the planning system, the 2008 Planning Act, this is a nationally significant infrastructure project. It has to go through the DCO system, can't be done locally. So we don't have any choice about that. So the Planning Inspectorate down in Bristol are the examining authority, and the Secretary of State, in this case for transport, is the decision maker based on what the Planning Inspectorate tell him after the examination. Obviously, that additional traffic would bring significant additional employment and business benefits, and we're in the middle of assessing those, along with all the other environmental impacts. We're also looking at the benefits, of course, the economic benefits that would accrue. And then the planning balance is not for us to determine, it's for the Planning Inspectorate and the Secretary of State, but the planning balance is always, are the economic and other benefits that are derived from an expansion like this, do they outweigh the planning disbenefits, which are generally the ones you would expect: additional air noise, or traffic on roads, or carbon, I guess, is the one on everybody's lips at the moment, particularly in that light of COP26 occurring later this year, and the consultation that the government has just launched yesterday. How does this fit within government's carbon plans? But it will also give us opportunities for going further and faster with our employment skills and business strategy, which is something we're developing now. Probably one of the biggest planks of that is going to be procurement, and how we make ourselves more accessible to local businesses and SMEs. We are a leaner organisation now, and I hope that will feed through into simpler processes sooner rather than later. But one of the things we need to think about is how we make that procurement work as well as it can, so that when we get this opportunity, or if we get this opportunity, I should say, we can make sure a lot of that benefit is focused locally, whether that's very locally or regionally. And of course, part of that will be how we can benefit, how the area can benefit from construction training initiatives, because it will need a large workforce to deliver this. It's not as big as some other major infrastructure projects, but it is significant. And we'd like as much of that as possible to be drawn from the local area. As well as allowing us, of course, opportunities to improve and expand some of those programs we already have existing, like STEM learning and apprenticeships. The infrastructure itself that we need to build is, as I said before, relatively simple. It sits within the airport boundary. It's largely to do with a complex system of taxiways to link the additional, or the Northern Runway, into the main one effectively, and to allow aircraft to taxi to and from in a safe and efficient manner. But there are some additional car parks to build, some office space, and probably 3 hotels will be required. And there will, and this is something we're assessing at the moment in connection with the Highways England and the local highway authorities, there will need to be some changes to the road system that serves the airport, unsurprisingly. But no residential properties need to be purchased. And early days, but we think that the noise impact levels are likely to be no worse than they were in 2018. But, something we're still working on, but that's how it's looking at the moment. So the big milestone for us that's coming up is a key part of the DCO process is the consultation. So the DCO process is, as I said, quite a long one. And the DCO, the Development Consent Order, is like a piece of legislation that the applicant writes themselves. And in it, they give themselves all the powers they think they need, whether that's compulsory purchase powers or moving rights of way or changing road systems, all of which we may need. Probably not the rights of way, but because it does give you such, or can give you such wide-ranging powers, it is obviously incumbent on us to do extensive consultation before we submit the DCO, and it gets thoroughly examined by the planning inspectorate once we have submitted it. So one of the most important things is the consultation itself. It needs to be done in accordance with the guidance, not so much guidance, it's actually statutory instructions from the 2008 Planning Act. And we have to write something called a Statement of Community Consultation, which we agree with our local authorities or consult with our local authorities on. Can't always agree with them, but we certainly consult with them and get their views. It's coming up, it could be in September this year, after the summer holidays. It will be a largely virtual consultation in line with most other major infrastructure projects at the moment, because it's still unclear exactly what conditions are going to be like in September. So we felt it more responsible to use a virtual consultation system. Most people will be able to access the virtual consultation. Most of us have access to the internet and the computer, but we recognise there are a constituency of people who don't, and we need to make sure that we can reach them as well. So there'll be a combination of things like a mobile consultation unit that drives around to visit various locations, particularly more far-flung ones. A call the expert bookable slot where, having read what you've read about the consultation, you can ring up and speak to a noise expert or an air quality expert or carbon and climate change expert about your particular question, which in some ways is, I think, better than the kind of village hall approach where you're all in one room, and whether you get to talk to the particular expert you wanted to is uncertain because usually there's a queue in front of you. But here you'll be able to book a slot during the course of the consultation and have your question answered. We're also going to be delivering webinars for key groups to explain the benefits and impacts of the scheme. And there will also be a consultation telephone line that you can ring up either to ask a question about how to engage or to request materials. So what can all of you do to help? Well, we'd encourage you to engage with our consultation, to go on the website, gatwickairport.com. It will be absolutely clear once you go on there, our normal website, where the consultation is, how to get to it. We need to make sure that it's front and centre so nobody can miss it. And to tell us your views, fill in the form, and by all means, make an appointment to call an expert, go online, read the documents, and understand the benefits and impacts. And of course, if you do support us, then writing to your MP to let them know during that period would also be extremely welcome. I hope I haven't galloped through it too fast, but that's the bones of the presentation.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. That's great. No, you weren't too fast. I think you got the pace just right, because there's quite a lot to take in. You helpfully at the beginning sort of set the context, obviously, in terms of where the airport is now and the impact of COVID, and you looked ahead a bit in terms of the prospects for getting back to something more like normal. In a minute, I'm just going to invite Jeremy to sort of comment on that, because Jeremy and I have both come from the same meeting, a Catalyst South webinar, as I mentioned up front, and there was some interesting interesting information there in terms of what's happening in other countries, the US and Europe in particular, in terms of the aviation building up again. So before I do that, Jeremy, you're like on warning. I should have said earlier, please do use the chat facility to ask questions or make comments. Andrew Gold has, and I'll be coming to Andrew in a second. Please use that, or put your hand up, either virtual or electronic, whichever you prefer. Okay, so that build up and suspense. Jeremy, would you like to reflect on some of the sort of interesting context, I think, that we heard this morning?
Yes, thanks, Jeff. It's a day of Gatwick, and obviously I'll declare an interest because I'm also working directly with Gatwick and Jonathan's team on some of the business and stakeholder engagement. So closely aligned with the project. It goes back actually in my own history, just to share with you that once upon a time my dad flew out of the Beehive when it was the terminal back in 1950 or 40, so closely related. In terms of what's happening at the moment and the conversation we were hearing this morning, there was basically that other parts of the world are seeing varying degrees of adoption of aviation, and I think one of the points that was made is that domestic and regional aviation in the States, for example, is back pretty much at pre-pandemic levels. I think one of the points out is actually the fact that the UK or Britain or England, British aviation is suffering constraints from vagaries of policy, either with this government or with other governments as well. So we're seeing some uncertainty, which makes it very difficult to plan. And from a potential traveller's perspective, it's quite frustrating. I've got friends who fly for American Airlines, and they're coming and going from Paris and Amsterdam and Frankfurt and all sorts of places, but it's proving difficult for our routes to open and potentially stay open. Middle East, I think one of the facts that came in is Middle East is currently running at about 67% of where we were pre-COVID. As I say, domestic in the States is almost back to where it was, and we see a lot of travel within Europe, which is potentially possibly because of the Schengen agreements and various things being picked up and going back to normal as well. In terms of future of aviation and where it's going, one of the things that was being very widely discussed is the decarbonisation of all forms of transport, really, and how that can be addressed. And it was interesting because I've had a bit of a week of discussions on this, and yesterday there was an event which was actually touching on the role that Surrey as an economy can take in developing hydrogen and alternative fuels, and also investment in what is called sustainable aviation fuel, which I believe, I'm not sure how much is in use at the moment at Gatwick, Jonathan, but Heathrow is trumpeting, and there's been flights which have been entirely flown on sustainable aviation fuel. How sustainable, where it comes from, and all these other things that need to be examined. Much is being made of the potential for electric aviation, but my personal view is obviously you still have to make electricity somehow, and you have to make batteries somehow. So it's not a clean picture, but the industry is very aware, and I think we've all become more aware of the impacts of carbon. I think the last piece is that, and I didn't see the results of it too closely, but there was a question posed at the beginning about how many flights would people take before pandemic and how many flights have people planning to take post-pandemic when it opens, and those two figures were about the same. But yesterday, and I'm going to talk slightly slowly because there was also a poll on one of the events yesterday about the impact of aviation on how much people would continue to fly and how much was important for business travel. And in our work that we did recently, the major corporates are definitely looking at reducing international travel. But smaller businesses are still having to rely on it. They still need to compete and they still need to travel. So the major corporates with multinational presence, they can see ways to diminish business travel, but particularly as we address exporting, then the smaller, medium-sized businesses still see that need. So I'm not quite sure if that's what you were looking for, Jeff, but you know, if you ask me something.
Great. That's spot on, Jeremy. I just felt it was important to have that sort of wider context in a way. because, you know, there might be some amongst us who are wondering what on earth are we doing talking about airport expansion and bringing the Northern Runway into operational use at a time when the aviation industry in our part of the world at least is at rock bottom. So I think it's important to have that sort of what's happening elsewhere and the way things are developing. Before I turn to Andrew, Jonathan, is there anything you'd like to reflect on or expand on what Jeremy has said?
I don't think so. I think you know, air demand will return. That's absolutely certain. It's an interesting question whether business travel will be more affected. I think business travel is bound to be more affected than leisure travel. The comfort for Gatwick, I guess, is that we are less dependent on business travel than some other airports. So we're likely to see less of an impact in that respect.
Yes. One way I've heard it put is that, you know, if you're pitching for a contract in the States and you hear that two of your competitors are flying out, you're not going to be the one that gets left behind. So I don't know, perhaps it won't go back to previous levels, but business travel is far from dead, I would say. I'm going to turn to Andrew now, Andrew Gold, who many of you will know, particularly relevant to Andrew because his business is very, very close to the existing runways, in fact. So Andrew asks a very specific question. You mentioned, Jonathan, that no housing would be subject to CPO because you explained that the vast majority of the development needed for the Northern Runway would be within the airport campus, unlike the former plans in terms of the second runway proper. But Andrew asks a specific question, which is clearly of interest to him. What about industrial properties?
No, I don't think we're anticipating having to compulsory purchase anybody's property. You'll need to wait for the consultation to see the detail of the plans, but the impacts will be around the edges of the road system because there will need to be some changes to the road system, but that's probably as much as I can tell you at the moment, but it's, yeah, wait for the consultation is probably the best answer I can give you at the moment.
Okay. Andrew, would you like to come back on that, or?
Yes, please. Yeah, and thank you for introducing me so nicely, but for those that don't know, we do share a common fence with Gatwick, so obviously I was very concerned about the specific use of the wording. I'm sure that wasn't intended to imply you were going to take any properties, because the last time I went to a meeting, Mr. Wingate said it would be contained within the current footprint, and I'm sure that hasn't changed, but just in case. But there were just a couple of points, if I may. This business of who will be travelling, I think smaller businesses will just stay as they were, because smaller businesses, and I am a smaller business, we travel when we have to. And I think most people know that bigger businesses, travel in its own right has become an industry, and it's on, you know, having meetings for the sake of having meetings has become an industry in its own right. And just before the pandemic, we were talking with a lot of our customers about cutting down on the amount of needless travel. So I do think that the bigger companies will stop using air travel. I'll still go if I have to go somewhere, or one of my minions will. You know, we'll go as we always did when we need to go. So I do think that will reduce. Some of the figures, can I just query them? Did you say that if you do nothing else and the airport stays as it is, you will increase the number of passenger movements from 47, I think you said, to 62 million, and that will be done with increasing the flight from 285 to 318,000 flights. And that's sort of, sorry, I'm an engineer, I do it. That's an increase of 30% of people, but only 12% number of flights. That's surely not all going to be done with bigger aeroplanes, is it? Or am I wrong?
Well, if you look at what happens in constrained airports, both Gatwick and another one down the road that you won't mention, you can see that the way that traffic grows when there aren't any more available slots has to be through airlines putting on larger aircraft. And the airlines realize this, and that's what they do. So when they want to grow their passenger numbers in response to demand, they have to put on a larger aircraft with more seats in it, or they have to sell more of the seats in the aircraft that they're flying and push it up from whatever the average is, 85 towards the 90s, in order to get more people through the system and to satisfy the demand and to make the profits that they're trying to make. So we do see that constantly in airports that are subject to slot constraint.
Okay. Andrew? I think he's sort of reluctantly accepting that. Is the look on his face.
I wasn't so much reluctant. I just wondered what the thinking was there. I have to be honest, it's just that one figure I sort of raised my eyebrows at, because I would have thought, I keep being told it's sort of the most efficient one runway-ish airport in the world, which I believe, and I've heard all your specialist guys speaking about this before. And if the numbers around 47 million, was it 46 in 2019? Yeah, I'm wondering whether you can actually make that step up. Look, if you can, that's good. If you can't, then, I thought it might have happened before now. I would have thought the imperative to do it was just as much 2 or 3 years ago.
All I can say is,
who knows?
If you look at where Heathrow went from over the last sort of 15 years, with more or less the same number of ATMs, how many more million passengers they've got through Heathrow, through exactly the same kind of mechanisms, you can kind of draw your own conclusions.
Well, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. I think that conversation sounds to me like one that can continue through the consultation process, actually. I've got some more points coming in, Jonathan, on the sort of business travel side. And as people know, I like pointing the finger at people. Ed Chin, you've made an interesting comment, shall we say. Is it something, rather than me read it out and make a complete mess of it, would you like to sort of make the comment in person to the group?
Sure. Thank you very much, Jeff. Nice to see you all on the call. Yeah, my point is really, I suppose aviation sort of shouldn't be sort of blamed, or there'd be a sort of a witch hunt, because it's a very sort of obvious sort of contributor to carbon emissions. There's so many positives to travel, and if we say worst case scenario, just stopped everyone from flying because it was terrible for the environment, that'd be a real shame, and it would, I think, reduce the amount of emphasis on development, excuse me, technology and innovation to make it greener, because obviously there's so many positives to travel personally and business-wise. So you touched on, Jonathan, the innovation, focus on innovation with the local area. I wonder if there are any particular sort of key areas of focus of that innovation.
It's going to be a really interesting time the next 6 months, I think, with the emerging government policy on aviation's place in climate change and the government's commitments to get to net zero. You may not have had a chance to read the 75 pages they put out yesterday, but I'm working my way through it. I think the government is clear that they believe innovation is coming, and that they see that, yes, they're talking about reviewing on a 5-yearly basis how innovation is coming through, which seems appropriate and sensible. But I think they're also clear, as I say, that innovation will happen. They will do their own part in trying to stimulate that innovation. But the airport, airlines, and the industry, people who make the aircraft, the people who make the fuel, the sustainable aviation fuel, all have a part to play in making sure this happens. You can't point at one person and say, it's all down to you. It's not the way the industry works. The airport has to be ready for it, to be able to deliver sustainable aviation fuel reliably to the aircraft. The aircraft manufacturers have to have an aircraft that can work with a higher blend of sustainable aviation fuel. And the $64 million question, there has to be enough sustainable aviation fuel produced economically to make those figures work. So no one person is in the driving seat here. It's an industry-wide cooperation that's going to deliver what the government is hoping for.
Yeah. Communication and collaboration are going to be key, aren't they? It'll be interesting to see how much there is open innovation and sort of breaking down the silos and working together. Hopefully lots.
I hope so. Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah. And we'd hope that in some way, the planned, it will happen. The innovation centre planned for Crawley, for Manor Royal, hosted by Thales. I would really like to see that develop strengths in that sort of green aviation, and innovation is so key to it. I think we have an opportunity in this part of the country to really set ourselves up as leaders. We have the challenge and we have the capability to address the challenge, but we need support to make that happen. As the chief executive of an airport a little bit further west than us has apparently said, we need to bear in mind that the problem is carbon, not aviation. So it's carbon reduction we need to address, not aviation reduction. That may seem a glib statement, but it's, tackle the bad, not the good. And and hopefully we can do that. Now, Jeff Downs has anticipated a question I was holding back in case everything dried up. But I'll ask it for Jeff, seeing as I thought of it first of all. You mentioned that noise levels would be retained at not above 2018, sort of estimates at this point. Now that might seem counterintuitive. You're going to have more airplanes flying, more passengers being carried. How can you possibly, to put it challengingly, how can you possibly say that you're going to keep noise levels at 2018?
Well, it's still early days and we're still working on it, but that's how things are beginning to look. The biggest factor in how noisy an airport is aircraft engine technology. And it has changed dramatically over the last 20 years. If you look at how noise contours have shrunk around airports, I know not necessarily everybody appreciates it or understands how it's changed, but airports have become significantly quieter over the last 20 years. I know because I grew up at the end of a runway, and I remember how noisy it was, and I can compare that to how it is today. That process will continue as engine technology continues to improve. And a wave of new aircraft are due in around about 2028, 2029, which will bring another step change downwards. And then there are waves planned beyond that. And that will bring a significant reduction in the amount of noise produced by the airport. Now, it's important to understand that there's a balance to be struck, what the DOT would call the balanced approach, where there's a trade-off where the airport is able to expand as demand requires, but at the same time, the community around it are able to have confidence that certain noise levels will not be exceeded and would reduce over time. That's the element or the kind of nuts of the balanced approach that DFT require all airports to sign up to, and that airport expansion projects are going to be held to account for. So it is a careful balancing act between expansion and impacts on communities from noise, and one that we will have to tread carefully.
Yeah, it is such an important issue. I sit on something called GATCOM, which is Gatwick Airport sort of Consultation Committee, and it is the single biggest issues, particularly by those who do not naturally support the airport. So some local authority representatives and the sort of the green campaign groups, if I can put it that way, It is sometimes dressed up as we want to save the planet, but the big issue is noise on local communities. So that is something that's going to undoubtedly, despite the 2018 figures, this is something that's going to come out very, very strongly in the consultation process and through the DCO process going forward. Jeremy, I will return to you because you have raised another important issue, which is the one of freight and a role for logistics. Traditionally, Gatwick hasn't been a great freight airport, if I can put it that way. And I do hear now, I've been from other businesses, particularly businesses from the freight industry, that there could be opportunities to grow the freight side of the business, not least if the plans for the Northern Runway go ahead. But Jeremy, I don't want to ask your question for you, so you please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I mean, I kind of know the answer a little bit because obviously I'm close to it, but it's really what plans there are to address freight. I mean, before pandemic, particularly when we had any number of long haul routes using 787s and 350s, then we got a lot of freight happening in those aircraft, and the short haul tends not to have it. It's really just if you've got any news or information about the role that freight and cargo might play within the plans. And then also, I mean, it's also just reflecting on the fact, and again, it was mentioned this morning that, and yesterday, that freight and logistics are becoming sort of prime users in the local property market, and that change is happening quite rapidly.
Mm-hmm. So we do anticipate a slight increase in the long haul mix in the fleet. So an uptick in the percentage of long haul flights. And obviously, as you say, with that comes the larger aircraft with more belly hold, and therefore an increase in the freight that makes some of those routes viable. But we think it won't go beyond what the airport can currently manage in its freight centre, cargo centre, likely to return to sort of some of the levels we saw a few years ago. So it's not going to be dramatic, but there will be an increase.
Thanks, Jonathan. I can't at the moment see any hands raised or new comments in the chat, but please, I'd encourage you to lift your hand, raise your hand, or put a comment in chat. But meanwhile, I'd like to come back to an issue that you did cover, and that's procurement, Jonathan. I just really want to give you an opportunity to expand on that a bit. And that's, again, it's related to some of the things you were saying about, wider economic benefit. You mentioned a sort of commitment to local procurement and to doing things to encourage that. And that is certainly something that we at GDB would want to really support you on. We've previously supported you on initiatives such as Gatwick Diamond, Meet the Buyer. So to begin with, just to register that we would be really, really keen to work with you on that whole local procurement side, but also just to give the opportunity if there's any more you feel you can say on that.
Probably not at the moment. I think that there are clearly going to be opportunities in the period from now until 2029, and 2029 being the year that, given planning permission, we would expect a dual runway operation to begin, or 2024, which is the kind of year we would expect a decision on the planning permission and therefore a construction program to potentially start. That seems like a long way off, 2024 and 2029. So there's plenty to be done in the interim on procurement. But of course, the real opportunities will come with an investment program to deliver this that will mean that by that time, I would hope we would have some improved processes in place that allow local businesses to really become part of that delivery.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Jonathan. Well, just to repeat, it's something we'd really like to work with you closely on. I'm going to turn to another Jeff now, and this time I'm going to ask him to put his point himself. Jeff Downs, you've made a comment on passenger numbers, function of the Northern Runway. Would you like to make your comments?
Yeah, it was just that question that Andrew raised about that increase in passenger numbers over and above the increase in aircraft. I just wondered, Jonathan, if that was also a function of the fact that with the Northern Runway, it means in releasing more capacity for the main runway, which can then take in turn the larger aircraft. And I wonder if that was a sort of factor in that sort of calculation.
Well, it's certainly a factor in the calculation for how much we can get through a dual runway operation. Yes.
Yeah.
We would expect to get. At the moment, we can peak at around 55 movements an hour. Back to your point, Jeff, about being the most efficient single runway. 55 an hour is as much as anybody does, probably more than most single runways. With a dual runway, we can get to about 70 movements an hour. So clearly there's more capacity just through the number of slots we would have available.
Just a quick supplementary, Jeff, because my question about noise levels was slightly different from yours with respect. The question I was asked,
all right.
When you use 2018 as the anchor for the noise levels, I just wondered what that looked like in 2018, how that went down, how happy everybody was in the community about 2018 levels. Could you comment on that, Jonathan?
Not knowing everybody in the community, it's not possible to comment on what everybody thinks.
No.
Obviously, there are some people who are unhappy with the level of noise generated by the airport. And there are some people who are indifferent, and some people who realise that having the airport there is what's providing their job. The reaction to aircraft noise varies enormously between people and can't be completely predicted. You can predict the average response to aircraft noise, but you can't predict individual response to aircraft noise. So it's a very difficult question to answer as to were more people happy with it or less happy.
Yeah, I just wondered if you just compared it with just pre-COVID, whether it had kind of there'd been improvements since 2018, and whether it was about the same kind of thing or whether it was slightly worse, really, just in general. But I know it's a difficult question, but it's the one that was on my mind when you mentioned the 2018 sort of anchor date.
The issue with noise, of course, is that the airport's been rather quiet for the last 15, 16 months.
Yeah.
So, as have all airports, and there will be a period for people surrounding all airports where, as the traffic comes back, they are reminded what things were like in 2018-19, and that's not going to be easy for anybody, I don't think.
Mm.
What I would say is that the people who are concerned about noise are far noisier than those who are concerned about the loss in terms of the economic benefit of the airport. We try to sort of rebalance that to some extent, and I don't want to be dismissive of people who suffer from the noise issue in particular communities, but it is quite concentrated and does need to be set against the wider economic benefit. And that is, and getting that balance right is something that we as a business organisation seek to do. We're running out of time a little bit, but I just wanted to ask you about something which is not directly, I suppose, to do with the Northern Runway, but you did mention in your presentation the safeguarding of land. Should government policy change in terms of the brand new runway? Can you, I don't want to take you off, I'm sure it's something so I won't apologise for asking it. Can you explain what the current position is in terms of the safeguarding of land? Because I know that there's the Crawley sort of local plan going through and everything else. Can you explain where we're at on that?
So there is an airport master plan relating to the additional runway, as we're now calling it. We used to call it the second runway. For clarity, we're now calling it the additional runway.
Yeah.
That plan is understood by government, and they have been safeguarding the land to allow the creation of that additional runway for quite a long time now, as I'm sure everybody's aware. And And at the moment, they believe that's still relevant and necessary to continue that safeguarding. So that's government policy rather than Gatwick policy.
Okay, that's great, thank you. I'm going to give the last word to Andrew, but as we're running out of time, I will put the point myself. How long will it take to increase the capacity of the Northern Runway? So how quickly will that sort of build up over time? Have you done any modelling on that, or is that too far in the future?
So we think we'll get to probably the ATM limit. So how long will it take us to release the slots? Probably 7 years or so, round about that, and then we'll we're likely to reach the slot limit, and then growth will continue, as we've already discussed, by will be a slot constrained airport again, and then growth will continue in the normal manner through airlines putting on larger aircraft as demand continues to increase, if indeed it does continue to increase. Nothing's certain. All you can tell is that all forecasts are wrong.
Okay. Now then, having said, I'll give the last word to Andrew. I'm actually going to give it to Sally because I can't ignore a question from the team. Sally's interested in the 3 new hotels you mentioned. I think she's eyeing up the prospect of 3 new GDB members, I think is where she's coming from here. But anyway, she puts the question more subtly. Will the 3 new hotels you mentioned be built in the airport campus or further out, or don't you know yet?
So at the moment, we're planning the airport campus. So we're imagining that 3 may be required on airport. Clearly, with the kind of expansion we're talking about, there will be demand for more than that in the local area, but it's not really for us to say where those might appear. And that's for the local plan to anticipate and to take account of as and when we were to get planning permission. Obviously, the local plan isn't going to do that before permission's been granted.
Okay, thank you. I think we've come to the end of our allotted time, not on Earth, but for this webinar. So just remains for me to thank you, Jonathan, for your presentation and for the way you've directly addressed all the questions raised. It's been really good. This is going to be a bit of a journey, actually, because we know the process that you're going through is going to take a while, even under the government's sort of speeded up planning processes. There will be different views amongst businesses. They won't all be absolutely supportive. Some will be, many, if not most, I would say, will be supportive in principle because they're aware of how important the airport is to our economy and how important the recovery is to our economy. But there will be a range of views. From GDB's point of view, we are highly supportive of the airport and recognise its role as the key driver of the economy. So we look forward to working closely with you and in order to give you the opportunity, to continue with this consultation process and to speak directly to businesses. I know you speak to business membership organisations sort of collectively, but I think it's good to speak directly to individual businesses as well, and we'll do all we can to sort of facilitate that. So, if everyone would like to join me in a round of applause for Jonathan.